If I could link in the minds of the British people immigration with membership of the European Union, then everything would change.
We haven't got enough houses now as it is, so where are you going to put them?
Just remember how many immigrants, like my family, like a lot of the people in this audience's family, have built this nation.
The problem has been that immigrants, asylum seekers, have all been confused in the popular mind.
Anti-immigration groups were behind disturbances in several English towns and cities last night. One of the protesters told me the country was full and foreigners were the problem.
The idea that we had some sort of open-door immigration policy is just absolute nonsense.
We wanted to see strict limits at a scale that was not going to disturb the nature of our very historic and peaceful country.
What I saw was the tabloid press becoming unhinged about this issue.
British jobs for British workers.
Net immigration in the tens of thousands.
My promise to you, to stop the boats.
There is a pervasive view that more immigration is better for the country.
It was too high, it wasn't being controlled, it needed to be controlled.
The fact is we're not in control of it, and to say otherwise is misleading the public.
Our ambition for ourselves is matched by our sense of compassion and decency and duty towards other people. Simple values, but the right
ones. The problems caused by the recession have left building contractors with a severe skills shortage. It's already biting, and it's likely to get worse.
British businesses are finding it increasingly difficult to hire skilled computer specialists.
The government's concerned about shortages of skilled workers as unemployment falls.
Back in '97, because I had employment as well as education, I was interested in what was happening with the labour market. And my input to that was to say, yes, there's an intermediate period in which we will need to accept quite large-scale legal migration.
Britain has a serious shortage of skilled workers, so much so that the government says it's in danger of holding back the economy. Could one solution be to relax immigration rules?
Because our economy was strong, and we were bringing a lot of people in to work in sectors where we needed that workforce, it also had an economic benefit for the country. In these early days of New Labour, there was still some nervousness about immigration, and particularly as immigration is being seen as a key central part of economic policy. I first started working on migration in the Cabinet Office. Insofar as we could draw conclusions, migrants on the whole contribute more in terms of the taxes they pay and so on than what they take out in terms of consumption of public services. Migrants help sort of grease the wheels of the labour market by filling in areas where there's particularly high demand or shortages. So migration had significant economic benefits for the UK. We produced a report called The Economic and Social Impacts of Migration. When the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, saw it, he actually said it would be quite beneficial to have this stuff informing the public debate. Well, there's no doubt that if you're attracting, for example, highly skilled migrants into the country, then it's got an economic benefit.
I don't think at the time I was elected as an MEP I'd realised quite what the extent of the Labour plan was, but it didn't take me long after I was elected to realise that we were entering into mass migration on a scale that had never been contemplated in British history. Well, at least Tony Blair was honest. He said, we're going to open the doors to the whole world.
The idea that we had some sort of open-door immigration policy is just absolute nonsense. We were constantly on it and legislating. And because you've got controls, you can then make the case as to why
controlled immigration is actually a good thing.
I saw a letter from Professor David Coleman of Oxford University about the whole immigration problem. And I thought that it made a lot of sense. The scale of immigration had trebled in a matter of 2 or 3 years, which over time we thought was going to make a big difference to the nature of our society. As a result of that, we wanted to see strict limits on immigration, confined to people we really needed, and at a scale that was not going to disturb the nature of our very historic and peaceful country.
I first came across Migration Watch in the early 2000s when I was in the Department of Work and Pensions, and some of the analysis that they produced of the numbers and projections of migration figures was actually quite useful and reasonably rigorous. There was, however, a pretty strongly xenophobic tone to a lot of their policy recommendations. It was all about migrants undermining British culture or whatever, which I thought was pretty obnoxious, frankly.
The risk always, if you're trying to talk about immigration from a logical and sensible point of view, someone will say, oh, he's a racist or whatever, and we just ignore that.
They were a very important group. Andrew Green, former British ambassador, sets up Migration Watch. And I remember within 2 weeks talking to Andrew Green, he said, look, we're going to be apolitical, we're just going to do numbers, we're just going to do analysis. And I thought, hooray. Because if I start to say this stuff without it being backed up by a rigorous academic source, I'm going to get in trouble. A little did I realize what that relationship with Migration Watch back in 2001 would mean.
"26 days after the attacks on New York and Washington, America and Britain have begun the military campaign against Osama bin Laden and the Taliban regime.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
Thousands of Afghan refugees are still trying to cross the border into Pakistan.
Caught up in a conflict they did not desire and can scarcely comprehend. These people no longer feel safe in their own country. The problem is that nobody else wants them.
The life in Afghanistan is very bad. So we can't live there. So we heard that in London, it's a good life for Afghan people, for refugees.
I worked most of my life in the UK with migrants, including asylum seekers and refugees. An asylum seeker is someone who has come to a country to seek protection under international law. No one leaves a country easily, especially if you're seeking asylum. Usually you're forced to leave. You had to leave because your life is in danger.
The evidence was that the majority of asylum seekers were really economic migrants. They weren't genuinely seeking asylum. Now, let me be clear about this. These people who are economic migrants, they're not bad people. They're going in search of a better life. But you can't have people coming in and claiming asylum on the basis of political persecution when they're really economic migrants.
Some have paid international traffickers, others simply taken a chance. Many are keen to be found so they can make a claim for asylum.
The encampment, known as Sangatte, on the shores of France, had become a magnet for people being smuggled by criminals, by organised gangs across the continent.
The Sangatte refugee camp is 2 short kilometres from the Eurotunnel terminal. The proximity is the problem. It's been called a departure lounge for illegal immigrants, people travelling without proper documentation. Their sole intention is to reach the UK.
I wrote my first migration story when the Daily Mail asked me to go to Calais. I had a VIP seat at the back of a lorry, and we proceeded to go through the security, no checks, into the ferry. After 4 hours, we entered the UK. As we were going up the motorway, we heard a knocking, and it was we had no idea who or how many people were in there. The doors were opened, and the first thing that happened was a voice saying, "I'm so sorry." The person climbed out. He was mid-30s. I questioned him on which country he came from. He said Iraq. He said his name was Adele, and he just ran. That was my first experience of meeting a migrant.
At the Eurotunnel terminal, a nightly drama is played out. A mass of refugees, sometimes hundreds, charge for the trains. Their hope is that a handful may get through.
I can't remember the issue of immigration coming up in the first 2 years of my time editing The Sun. But that changed. There was huge anger on the paper internally and from the readers about an issue that was being mismanaged by the Blair government.
The legal bill for asylum seekers more than doubled to £138 million last year.
In some cities in the UK, local authorities are struggling to cope with the extra strain the record number of asylum seekers are putting on services.
Personally, I think they milk in the country, to be honest with you.
Another factor which very much changed everything, which cannot be underestimated, is 9/11. That changed the view of people coming from certain parts of the world. It's not that we're going to be overrun by people, it's that we don't know who's coming into the country. It became a security story and a security threat.
Britain has agreed to take 1,000 Iraqi Kurds on work visas and about 200 Afghans. The rest will be dealt with by the French.
But when told their only option is to apply for asylum in France, they start to chant.
England! I want England! 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 England!
We legislated, we pulled them back down. I remember having meeting after meeting in Downing Street on this issue, and in the end changing the personnel in order to get the result we wanted.
If you reassure people that you know what you're doing, that we've got a grip of the problem, that will open their minds and their hearts to those who really genuinely should be here in this country.
There was this persistent sort of background noise from particularly Tory supporting papers who seemed at times to find ways almost every day to contrive to make immigration and asylum seekers a front page issue, whipping it up.
I would spend a lot of time at focus groups. The Sun readership was white, male, and if you had images on the front of the paper of people who were not white, coming from parts of the world that our readers would have no understanding of, the emotion that would elicit from our readers was fear. That comes from racism. I don't know these people. They may harm me, they may harm my family. These tropes, they're manna from heaven, because not only do they get everybody going, they sell. I had huge misgivings about the direction of our own coverage of this issue.
What I saw was tabloid press becoming unhinged about immigration. And there was this story that asylum seekers were eating swans. I came to this country as a refugee, and I've been working in this field of protection and migration justice for 30 years. And it was the craziest thing that I've ever seen on a front page. But The Sun did not publish an apology, they published a correction buried somewhere in the back pages, like a tiny little correction.
And there was a front page a few months after I left The Sun that immigrants are killing and eating the Queen's swans, which clearly was not the case. But if you hear that, you're going to go into conference and say, guess what, boss? And nobody in that room is going to say, hang on a minute. Do you think we could just double check that?
Are the large number of asylum seekers in danger of causing social unrest? So, how should we deal with asylum seekers? Do you think asylum seekers are causing social unrest, social tension, racial tension, Elaine?
I don't think it. I know it. I've experienced it.
I know for a fact from a neighbour of mine, some of the asylum seekers have paid £2,000, £3,000, £4,000, £5,000 to come over here. Where did they get their money from in the beginning?
Is Britain a soft touch for asylum seekers, or are we turning away the poor and the desperate to face persecution, even death?
You'll be able to vote by phone, text, or interactive TV. Then we'll compare your vote with the real Home Office decision.
To this day, I don't know what the BBC was thinking that this would achieve, but it was really a scary time.
If people are reading it on their front pages and they're seeing it on their television night after night, they're going to react.
We seem to be a very open country, whereas anybody is allowed to come here and do anything and get away with anything.
How many people do you need to welcome? I mean, there could be a lot more done for the elderly people and everything else, couldn't there? You know, people of our own nationality.
The problem has been that immigrants, asylum seekers, illegal asylum seekers have all been confused in the popular mind. Confusion, which is whipped up by elements of the popular press and some politicians.
I think my first television interview, certainly with the BBC, that was a step forward.
Recently, there's been a surge in asylum seekers, and today Migration Watch UK claims that over the next decade, there'll be 2 million new arrivals.
Clearly, migrants have value. Some migrants have value to our economy. The balance is between the value that some of them bring and the sheer cost in infrastructure of 2 million people every 10 years.
The press was quite good on asylum because you could take photographs of it, but it was very weak in other respects, and there was certainly very little understanding of what it might lead to. We were trying to say to the world at that time, it's immigration as a whole that matters, not just asylum seekers. In my view, there was a conspiracy that did lead to a substantial increase in immigration.
There was clearly a big danger that the issues relating to the growth in the number of asylum seekers would just dominate the agenda and push out any rational discussion of the broader economic and social issues surrounding migration.
I worked as an advisor to David Blunkett in the Home Office. Everyone was focused on asylum, the view that was held by David and by Tony Blair and others, that if you could sort out the problems in the asylum system, if people were fully reassured by that, then they would not be bothered about legal migration, people coming through the economic routes to work and study here. So that was their settled view, but I was increasingly disagreeing with it. And I did start to try and have the argument inside Labour that actually some of this is about the immigration system as a whole.
Polling and focus groups consistently, I think, showed us that most voters don't really differentiate between different categories of people coming to our country. They tend not to differentiate between somebody who's coming here, for argument's sake, as an asylum seeker or somebody who's coming here as an economic migrant. The question is, are there too many people here?
My view is that, we need to think about whether we need to change our policy on that and also the way that we talk about that. But that felt like a pretty lonely position to have within Labour, and we felt that we were banging our heads against the wall a bit on that.
Michael Howard has been confirmed as the new leader of the Conservative Party.
How will you actually change the Conservative Party under your leadership?
More of that later.
Well, when you become leader of the opposition, you obviously think about the issues which you think are important to people. Immigration was always one of those issues which I would have to raise, whether or not I was going to be accused of being racist, from the word go.
In the early 2000s, we were still living with the memory of Enoch Powell and the things that he had said. Some of the things he said were right, of course. The thing was immigration was much too high and would have implications, etc. But he overshot very seriously and shot himself in the foot, really. So we had to be particularly careful not to appear to be part of any such movement. One of the key elements that we were stressing is what we called net migration. It's the number of people who come to the UK for more than 6 months, minus the number who leave. That is the key.
I didn't like Migration Watch, and it felt to me that these were people that were likely to cause problems, not find solutions to problems. They are assisting this sort of industry of fear. But nevertheless, they were very, very important because they put numbers on the problem. And once you have numbers, you have an irresistible force in the newsroom.
We are talking about a net increase of people coming into this country over those going out of about 200,000 people. That's a city the size of Milton Keynes or Newcastle. Now, for how long is that sustainable?
Well, it's permanently sustainable at that level.
Jeremy Paxman talked about 200,000 a year for 10 years. Well, nobody else had used those numbers before, but they were indeed our numbers.
There is, in your judgment, no notional maximum population of this country?
No, I don't think there is, but I think we need to work on much more robust projections.
It was changing the whole nature of the debate to make people aware that numbers are important, were growing and needed to be considered.
So we can just carry on adding another million every 5 years, more or less indefinitely?
No, I see no obvious limit. I see a balance.
I was in the room, actually, when he gave the interview. This was not a line that we had rehearsed before, and even as he said it, I sort of winced, because I knew it was going to be a problem.
That was gold dust for us, so it was very controversial, and we felt that we were getting places.
It's going to become a very crowded island, isn't it?
It is a crowded island. We've always been a crowded, vigorous island. Parts of it are much less crowded than others, and there is a balance to be struck.
I got on extremely well with Jeremy, but that was an occasion when I could have thumped him. And I still can't answer the question, what is the upper limit that is acceptable in our country?
What David Blunkett said was absolutely consistent with the whole attitude of that Labour government. They didn't think there was an upper limit of immigration. They were encouraging it. And it took place in very large numbers.
Came at a time when people felt that we didn't care about overall numbers. And it is true that we weren't caring enough about overall numbers.
What David said was completely misinterpreted. What he was saying was that provided it's a decision as to who comes in and who doesn't, there's not some arbitrary number that you put in place. You don't choose a magic number.
There are times in life when pressure groups are really important. They display a widespread commitment and feeling. And there are other times when you have an organisation, if I could use the expression, one man and a dog, but they get enormous attention. And it's a real worry when that happens because it changes the nature of the debate.
Numbers are a polite way of expressing hostility to migration as a whole.
Under the proposals announced by the Home Secretary on Monday, will net immigration rise or fall?
The abusers will be weeded out, and as a result of an end to chain migration, the numbers probably will fall, yes.
Isn't the difference between us that we will impose an annual limit on immigration? He refuses to do that, and isn't that why only a Conservative government can be relied on to bring immigration under control? I did meet Andrew Green, and I think that the information they've provided has been quite useful.
The Conservatives were interested, I think, because they could see the public didn't like the scale of immigration that was developing, and they could see that this was leading to difficulties.
We've seen immigration triple under Mr. Blair. We believe that immigration has to be limited and brought under control.
All these people seem to come in and before you know it, they've sort of got loads of money. So, but yeah, I do think that we let too many people in.
There were very real concerns in large sections of the public about this issue, and I was responding to those concerns in a practical and entirely responsible way.
The slogan, "Are you thinking what we're thinking?" It was saying some things which we, the silent, right-thinking majority, think, but which they, the sort of fashionable people in Westminster, don't think we should say.
I thought Michael Howe was right to highlight the importance of immigration. It had grown hugely in recent years. It wasn't properly being discussed and debated by politicians. Indeed, I was involved in writing that 2005 manifesto.
In the 2001 national campaign, it was regarded as untouchable. Now it's mainstream, and lots of candidates right round the country will tell you how effective it's been for them on the doorstep.
We've got Michael Howard, and he's beginning to hopefully get the country back together. Our heritage, what really belongs to us.
The people that are coming in, I think it should be limited, and if he can do something to help that, then fine.
And I talked about policing and health and education, but I did also talk about immigration. I was frustrated by the extent to which the media focused almost, well, very largely on immigration.
Tony Blair has accused the Conservatives of playing politics with asylum and immigration out of desperation.
I think that our work during that election achieved a great deal in terms of immigration being understood as a problem.
Tony Blair has won an historic third term in office, but Labour's majority in the House of Commons has been sharply reduced.
I've listened and I've learned, and I think I have a very clear idea of what the British people now expect.
Ironically enough, I was told by one senior Labour figure after the election that the mistake I made was not going hard enough on immigration.
It was too high, it wasn't being controlled, it needed to be controlled. I thought that was essential, and I think Andrew Green was helpful in that regard. I met him after 2005. He actually lived near my constituency, and I went to go and see him. He said, "Come and see me, I'm a former diplomat, but also I've got this project on migration." And actually, Andrew Green brought some rigour to the different categories, the different policies, the different potential approaches.
10 new countries have been formally welcomed into the European Union. The historic expansion creates the world's largest trading bloc, bringing the population of the EU to 455 million, and has been greeted with celebrations across the continent.
We had 600,000 vacancies in the system. That's huge. How are we going to fill those jobs?
The economy was doing well. It needed more people than we had in the UK. And there was a very strong sense from Number 10 and in the Treasury and the business departments of Whitehall that it was good for the economy to encourage legal migration.
We were big champions of European enlargement, Britain, both under the previous government and under my government particularly, were staunch advocates of these Eastern European countries, the former Soviet Union countries, coming into the European Union and joining NATO.
We face a clear choice. Use the opportunities of accession to help fill those gaps with legal migrants, able to pay taxes and pay their way, or deny ourselves that chance, hold our economy back, and in all likelihood see a significant increase in illegal working and the black economy.
We described that as unforgivable because we could see that the numbers were already high and rising. This was a decision that was completely unnecessary, and we were strongly opposed to it.
I remember the 3 UKIP MEPs were in the chamber in Strasbourg voting on EU enlargement. And I remember that day, we were the only British MEPs that voted against former communist countries joining. As we left the chamber, I turned to my 2 colleagues and said, that is the best day's work we will ever do as MEPs.
The Nigel Farage narrative goes back a long way. That's a consistent rhetoric in British politics, and Nigel Farage just picked it up and ran with it. The point about the anti-European narrative was that underlying it was a fear and concern about foreigners generally.
At London's Victoria coach station, another coach arrives from Poland. It's a common sight. 18 out of the 30 companies that operate from here are from the new EU accession states. The flow of people they brought has been profound.
I was overwhelmed by the numbers coming in. I did interview people as they came off the buses, and it became clear to me that, this was actually out of control. And I know we hate the word control because it sounds as though you're anti-migrant, but, a country without any borders isn't really a country at all.
I think my career and UKIP's propulsion was directly down to the increasing size of the population as a result of opening the door unconditionally to a lot of people from former communist countries.
I think EU enlargement was our biggest mistake. Given that we understood what a potent political force immigration could be, it was a mistake not to allow a transition period.
It was understandable we did what we did, which is prioritise the economy. But part of the problem on immigration was that it would always be the economy first and immigration second, or it would be foreign policy first and immigration second. And actually, sometimes immigration needed to come first.
After EU enlargement, when we started to get quite significant numbers of people coming to the UK, we started to find in the opinion research this growing sense that actually our public services are already under pressure.
It meant that immigration went from being, issue number 5 or 6 in the opinion polls to often being issue number 1 or 2.
They're coming in this country. No wonder we've got no hospital beds.
I myself am not racist. I just want to see an end to all this immigration over here.
The language people started to use in focus groups is one of fairness, and it doesn't feel fair that someone can come to our country from a different country and draw on our public services, to draw on our benefit system, social housing.
I think they're letting too many immigrants in. They're taking all our jobs. I've been looking for work for a long time now. There's nothing about.
I remember having some conversations with Treasury officials. It was their view that migration was positive for the economy as a whole in terms of taxes, less the use of public services and benefits. But what they missed was a lot of the concern.
It characterised us in the way that our political enemies had been trying desperately to characterise us for the previous 7 years in government.
This will be a new government with new priorities. Let the work of change begin.
Figures for the last 10 years show the net number of migrants have trebled.
We're now receiving very nearly a migrant a minute, and that simply can't continue.
It means more homes are needed, and to go with them, more schools, shops, offices and hospitals. And some think these kind of increases are simply unsustainable.
And there's the real concern. Whatever economic benefits there might be from immigration, there are social consequences too. If worries over resources aren't dealt with, resentment might become explosive.
I moved to number 10 in 2007 with Gordon Brown. It was becoming clearer and clearer to me that immigration was a major issue because we did have bigger numbers coming from Eastern Europe than were expected. Also, you started to hear about the pressure that new migrants were putting on public services and on housing. While some of this was exaggerated, actually some of it was real.
On the one hand, the government wants to talk up the economic benefits of immigration. Yesterday, it was telling us that foreign workers added £6 billion to the economy last year. On the other hand, feedback from official bodies around the UK now shows us something of the downside, with pressure on public services and concerns about the impact on crime, health, housing and education. The government's critics say action is long overdue.
This is our vision. Britain leading the global economy by our skills and creativity, by our enterprise and flexibility, drawing on the talents of all to create British jobs for British workers.
He famously used the phrase, the slogan, British jobs for British workers, talking at the party conference and at the TUC.
And if we make the right decisions, we can advance even further and faster to full employment than ever before, with a British job on offer for every British worker.
I don't like to bandy around words like lie, but I think, there is something a little bit misleading about the claim that you can set up a category of jobs simply intended for British people as a member state of the European Union, because that would fall foul of European Union law. There goes my Christmas card from Gordon.
We were going to have migrants coming here and taking jobs. Gordon never thought that wasn't going to happen. So in some sense, he was just setting himself up for failure. I thought it implicitly appeared to adopt some of the rhetoric of the far right.
And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I did a bit more research to find out where he got his slogans from. Here's one he borrowed off the National Front. Here's another one he borrowed off the British National Party. Yes. Where was his moral compass when he was doing that?
The strapline, British jobs for British workers, was just a gift. Suddenly you could see a Union Jack on it, and you could see the far right in particular going into spasms of joy over this. British jobs for British workers. I still feel uncomfortable with it now.
For the first time in Britain, a council has the BNP as its second biggest party.
I get on the bus here and I'm the only white man sitting on the bus sometimes. I 100% agree with this man. Give us back our country.
When I was first elected onto the London Assembly, 2008, I sat next to an elected member of the BNP because over 5% of London voters voted for what was basically a neo-fascist party in frustration about immigration policy.
David Cameron was aware that immigration was a huge issue, and he wanted us to have a tough policy that bore down on the numbers.
Well, at the moment, the net figure is about 200,000, so that's 2 million over 10 years. It's a large number. We think it should be substantially lower than that.
It's about 200,000 net now. It was about 50,000 net when Labour came to power. Is that substantially lower? Is that the sort of thing?
Well, that is substantially lower. Obviously, there's a numerical fact, and I think that the sorts of numbers that you've talked about in the past is actually at a time when Britain found it easier to integrate new migrants. I think that sort of figure, but when we get closer to election, we may be able to say more.
We had been trying to get policy focus for some time, that there needs to be a cap and it needs to be 100,000.
We're full of people. We really do not need many more. The trains are absolutely packed with people, as you can see. The motorways are stuffed with cars. There's housing, schools, hospitals. It's just getting very difficult to live.
And we had been saying there must be an actual target for government departments to work to.
I'd say the discussion about numbers is entirely shallow, and there were various pressure groups in this country who thought it was all a numbers game. There's a Britain is full approach to things, and I thought it, in a pernicious way actually, sought to poison public debate.
Financial markets worldwide fall following the emergency rescue of a major American bank.
Was the biggest crash on the London stock market for more than 20 years. Over £90 billion were wiped off shares today.
The long-running crisis in financial markets is having a bigger and bigger impact on the real economy.
It's been another day of losses in the job market.
Unemployment looks set to rise to 2.2 million by the end of 2009.
Economic insecurity is always a good breeding ground for anti-immigrant feeling. If you have high levels of unemployment and high levels of immigration, that narrative about people coming and stealing our jobs is more powerful.
I just feel that the government are giving more support to the immigrants rather than British people.
Well,
I feel very betrayed, to be honest.
Wave of wildcat strikes sweeping parts of Britain in support of protesters at the Lindsey oil refinery in Lincolnshire. There's anger at the use of foreign labour while British workers are unemployed.
We will take action!
But these men are dismayed and angry, especially because the government has made public statements about British jobs for British workers.
You don't have to go across to Europe to bring people in to do skilled jobs when the skilled men are here. And they've been doing it for years.
In the middle of the strike, a BNP activist hands out leaflets and pledges support.
I don't want the British Nationalist Party on this protest.
But later he's asked to leave by the men. A union source said their aims didn't match those of the workers.
I was the Minister of State for Borders and Immigration. Despite the fact that we had the global financial crisis, immigration, actually as a policy area, increased in its saliency with the British public. The instability and the uncertainty, the fear that people had about their economic prospects, it was certainly a very, very tough time.
Nicholas John Griffin from the British National Party.
Someone has to stand up for the majority indigenous population of this country just to get a level playing field, because racism in this country overwhelmingly is directed against people who look like me.
The leader of the BNP, Nick Griffin.
This was the night he'd long dreamed of. The night Nick Griffin walked on stage to be treated like any other politician, to debate with opponents who used to refuse even to share a platform with him.
There were huge crowds of very, very angry people who thought it was utterly inappropriate that somebody like Nick Griffin, who is a far-right racist, was being given the oxygen of publicity.
The immigration invasion, an act of deliberate, calculated genocide against our ancient race and nation. So successive governments are committing genocide against their own people. Is that your theory?
I'm afraid that's the case. Yeah, that's certainly how
That's
it
your
looks.
theory.
From the ordinary grassroots position, when all the political elite celebrate all the multicultural diversity and
Do you know the definition of genocide?
For
How
example.
appalling, Mr. Griffin, that you use that word in that way.
What Nick Griffin said was so frightening and unpleasant for those of us from a migrant background.
It was definitely a moment to expose a far-right racist.
The protesters see him as being a man with a National Front past and a political inheritance that goes right back to the Nazis.
For every person who watched the whole of the programme, there are at least 10 others who thought, well, that's interesting, they must be part of mainstream politics now they're being invited on to Question Time.
The
Queen has kindly agreed to the dissolution of Parliament, and a general election will take place on May the 6th.
And this election is about big choices. 5 more years of Gordon Brown, or change with the Conservatives.
Our manifesto will hardwire fairness into British society.
Controlling how many people come to this island is right up there in the list of voters' concerns, according to the polls.
I think what we should aim to do is to go for a number that doesn't, in the long term, doesn't add still further to our population. Now, roughly 100,000 Brits leave every year. Now, we should be able, roughly within that, to get immigration down to a similar level.
I do think we need controls and we need limits.
Limits, so 100,000?
No, well, I think where I disagree with Andrew is to say you can fix a limit and say that's the limit.
I have to be careful to respect people's confidences in this. I think what I'll say is in the run-up to the next election, we were in touch with the Conservative Party in many forms, both their officials and more senior people in the party.
We would like to see net immigration in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands. I don't think that's unrealistic. That's the sort of figure it was in the 1990s.
We were delighted. That's exactly what we wanted to see. I don't think it'd be fair to say the Conservatives pinched our idea, but it would be fair to say that it was originally our idea.
I wasn't talking about it in terms of race or culture so much. It was about numbers and pressure. It's about turning up at primary school and finding you've got lots of new kids in your class and it's overcrowded. It's about going to the doctor's surgery and finding there are many, many more people trying to get on the doctor's surgery list. And if you talk about numbers and pressure, you need to have some idea about the sort of number you're aiming for.
I was surprised when the Conservative opposition committed to it. You know, it's a hostage to fortune, but actually on an issue as emotive as this, that was clearly driving not just public concern but public anger, that was not just a foolish thing to do, but a reckless thing to do.
Early that morning, Jack Straw and Gordon Brown had come to my constituency, a marginal constituency. We'd held a debate in front of the cameras. It had gone very well. We were celebrating over a cup of tea when the Prime Minister's car left, saying that went really well. We got back to the office after canvassing, turned the news on to see just down the road in Rochdale, 5 miles away, the Gillian Duffy.
It's 6 months. You can't say anything about the immigrants because you're saying that you're but all these Eastern Europeans what are coming in, where are they flocking from?
So I was editing the 6 and 10 o'clock news when Gordon Brown was hot mic'd.
It's a disaster.
What did she say?
Oh, everything. She's just a sort of bigoted woman.
There was a very quick decision at the BBC to use the material.
Gordon Brown calls a voter a bigoted woman, a major embarrassment on the campaign trail.
You're joking.
Because, I mean, how do you feel about that?
Where was I a bigot? Why has he come out with words like that? He's going to lead this country and he's calling an ordinary woman who's just come up and asked him questions what most people would ask him.
For the person who is leading the country to say that a person who was raising issues about immigration was a bigot just exploded.
Prime Minister, do you still think Mrs. Duff is a bigot?
I wanted to come here and say to Gillian, I was sorry, to say that I'd made a mistake, but to also say I understood the concerns that she was bringing to me, and I had simply misunderstood some of the words that she used.
It was so important because it did reveal a reality that the Labour government had wanted hidden, that's what they really thought about people who were concerned about immigration. And others had spent 5 years in opposition arguing that this is a real issue, this is a real issue for real people. Stop saying it's just Tory rhetoric. It's not.
it is packed with them on all the other council estates. This is the only one in Rochdale that isn't packed with the immigrants.
There's rafts and rafts of them. It's packed, Rochdale. And it's not a point of being bigots. Everybody should have the fair share of them.
In the 2010 general election, we knew that immigration was going to be a big issue. But, you know, we'd had eight or 9 years of very negative headlines, perceptions that the Home Office was not run well. So against that backdrop, the changes we'd made, even though I felt we had a better narrative, it was too little, too late, and we knew we'd lost the public's trust on immigration.
It's going to be a hung parliament with the Conservatives as the largest party.
Within the past hour, Gordon Brown has said he intends to stand down as Labour leader and Prime Minister.
I aim to form a proper and full coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. We have the chance of a 5-year government where we really can grapple with the problems the country faces.
So we were landed with this objective, which the Conservatives had put in their manifesto, and which they then treated as hard government policy, which the Liberal Democrats fundamentally disagreed with. It was unenforceable because there were certain things we couldn't control, migration from Europe, and also if British people chose to stay here, this actually pushed up net immigration. It was absurd. It's not something we could control. I mean, we're not North Korea.
There were officials in the Home Office, I discovered, were quite tough-minded about immigration, but economists around the place weren't. They subscribed to the view that immigration was good for the economy.
I was chief economist at the Cabinet Office and in number 10. And I wrote a memorandum to David Cameron saying, you will not hit the tens of thousands target unless you impose severe restrictions on either or both people coming as skilled workers or as students, both of whom, of course, we know are very significantly economically beneficial to the UK. So you are either setting yourself up to fail or you're going to be forced into taking economically damaging decisions.
They tried to argue against it, but were seen off by David Cameron and George Osborne, who said, look, we've made this pledge, we are going to stick to it.
Jonathan Portes is a very intelligent man, but he didn't really agree with anything the government was doing. So he wasn't the first person I was going to listen to, frankly.
I did get a note back from the Prime Minister's private office, his chief political advisor, saying, actually, Damien Green has advised the Prime Minister that this is perfectly doable. Here's how the numbers add up. And he got these numbers from Migration Watch. I looked at the numbers and I immediately said, no, these don't add up. You've done them wrong. You don't understand how the visa system or the immigration system really works.
No, I'm not going to comment on Portes. I have a very low opinion on him, and I'm not prepared to talk about him.
I essentially got another note back from the Prime Minister saying that he didn't want to know. That is one of the reasons why I left the Cabinet Office not long after.
Well, Migration Watch undoubtedly had a very significant influence on certainly thinking in the Home Office and with the Prime Minister, and with core ministers, they were very influential.
I thought Migration Watch were worth listening to because they brought a lot of data and a lot of rigour and some policy proposals.
We were in close contact with the Home Office at every level, actually. We thought it was doable. We had expected it to be done, as they did too.
I remember in meetings in the cabinet room where Green and his organisation, which were constantly warning of the dangers of high immigration levels, were effectively treated as advisors to the government.
Ultimately, government policy was all decided by the government, by me and the Deputy Prime Minister and the team, but actually having a group of people saying, here's some ideas for how you can control immigration better, that was a good thing.
And I believe that that will mean net migration to this country will be in the order of tens of thousands each year, not the hundreds of thousands every year that we've seen over the last decade.
One of the aims of my government was to make sure our economy became less dependent on immigration. You know, while you've got 5 million British people of working age on out-of-work benefits, you're never going to have successful immigration control. So we did have a welfare reform policy to get those people back to work. We had a training and skills policy. So I don't accept that getting net migration to below 100,000 was impossible.
I think where it ran into difficulty was with other government departments. Every government department had some group of people that they said were vital and they must have them. We helped where we could on that.
Many of the Conservative Secretaries of State were in principle in agreement with this idea of reducing net migration, but in practice they were looking for ways to exempt their own departments. You know, the impact on social care, for example, on medical professionals, on business. You know, there were people right across government who were arguing for exemptions.
Any government is desperate for economic growth. A lot of that is going to come from migration. So you can see that tension, that argument playing out sometimes in cabinet.
David Cameron would not talk to me, of course, about his relationships with other ministers, but he clearly was disappointed that progress was not being made as he wished it should be and as he was committed to.
David Cameron famously remarked once that the only people in government who actually wanted to bring immigration down were him, Theresa and me, because that was our job.
It invested very heavily in getting net immigration below 100,000. They were way, way off target. I think there was an element of panic.
I don't think there's an issue on which public trust has broken down more between two so-called major parties in the great British public than immigration, both legal and illegal. Neither the Labour nor the Conservative parties want the truth to get out, which is that as part of a European Union, we have a complete open door to the whole of Eastern Europe, and we cannot limit the numbers that come here. And my sole purpose was if I could link, in the minds of the British people, immigration with membership of the European Union, then everything would change.
For years, politicians have promised the public an Australian-style points-based system, and today I will actually deliver on those promises.
The immigration policy put in place after Brexit, in my view, was not the right one.
It was more about rhetoric than it was about reality. It was all about telling the British public what they wanted to hear.
We will pass new laws to stop small boats, making sure that if you come to this country illegally, you are detained and swiftly removed.
We didn't need to be pushed into this position. We were taking it seriously.
But as long as the Prime Minister refused to support me, my hands were tied. This was a crisis and a political catastrophe.
What are the impacts of recent changes to UK citizenship? Explore the Open University's stories of two fictional families by scanning the QR code on screen now or visiting bbc.co.uk/immigration and following links to the Open University.